Hello, my name is Peg Williams, and today I'm going to give a talk on Colorado's mineral belt, and this is courtesy of the Mesa County Libraries. So this talk is a brief investigation into Colorado's mineral endowment and its heyday of extraction. What I want to talk about is the interplay between resource quality, price, and technology, mainly for gold, but we'll touch a little bit on silver. So this first picture is a photo of the Eagle Bird Assay Office at Battle Mountain. Most all the photos that I'm using are courtesy of History Colorado. So thank you to History Colorado for the use of the photos. So Colorado has many interesting sites from its mining past. There's more than 400 sites that date from the mid to the late 1800s. Colorado has these better preserved than some other states because many of the sites are inaccessible in winter because they're in the mountains and even hard to get to in the summertime. This slide shows the New London mine and the Hilltop sites that are both in Park County. The Hilltop building unfortunately collapsed the winter before this one due to the heavy snow load, and that is a sad part of some of these historic sites as they're gradually weathered away through time. In the early days of mineral exploration and development, mining districts were formed around discoveries. These mining districts were officially designated areas, and they were used to locate claims because these areas had never been reliably surveyed previously. So the resident miners would adopt a district name, boundaries, and they would figure out the laws governing the mining activity in each of these areas. After they instituted land surveys and the Colorado Territory was organized into counties, most of these lost their legal significance, but many of the names are still used today. So this list shows the top districts for gold and silver in the state. You can see that silver production was overall much, much larger than gold production. Cripple Creek was the preeminent gold-producing district, while Leadville was far and away the largest silver district. I put this slide in to highlight the volume differences between gold and silver, which are the precious metals, and copper, lead, and zinc. You can see that Colorado produced many more times silver than gold, and the shift from ounces to pounds shows you just how much more copper, lead, and zinc were produced. So let's talk a little about why Colorado has this wealth of mineral resources. This is a map of the historic metal mining districts of Colorado, and you can see that they fall into a general trend that is oriented kind of north, 43 degrees east. This is the Colorado mineral belt. It's a zone of weakness in the Earth's crust that crosses Colorado and extends back into the earliest times. It essentially runs from Durango to Boulder. So mineralized rocks are found in this zone. Certainly there are some outliers, but most of Colorado's mining towns and camps were found within it. Cripple Creek, the Hans Peak area, and Summitville all lie outside the Colorado mineral belt, but their formation is thought to relate to the same processes that emplaced the ore within the mineral belt. So we'll have a little bit of geology here. Precious metals are generally emplaced from deep earth sources that intrude into overlying rocks. Igneous rocks are those that are formed by high heat in a melting environment deep within the earth. When they're uplifted, these are granites. Sedimentary rocks result from the erosion of elevated rocks, and they're deposited in streams, lakes, deltas, and offshore. Metamorphic rocks are those that are involved in deep burial, resulting in a change from heat and pressure. They're changed in structure, but they're not melted the way igneous rocks are. So we see ore deposits in all these different types of rocks in Colorado. So the precious metals are often contained in the last surge of an igneous intrusion. The surge often follows lines of weakness in the adjacent rocks, such as faults or joints, and form veins along these zones of weakness. They've apparently followed such fractures in the Colorado mineral belt. This slide shows you some of the geology of the mineral belt. The mineral belt cuts indiscriminately across the geologic grain of Colorado, so it's seemingly independent of the tectonic elements. It's really a unique geologic feature, and it is very unusual. Across a period of about 70 million years, from the late Cretaceous through the late Cenozoic, there were two very long-lived magma chambers that spawned both late Cretaceous, early Tertiary, and mid-Tertiary magmas. So these were the two main periods of mineralization. On the map, you can see two sets of shear zones that are localized the ore-related igneous activity. These formed some 1.4 billion years ago, so they're very, very old, during the Precambrian. The main set of shears is oriented northeast, and the secondary set of shears is oriented northwest. So it's most evident in central Colorado, where you can see the mineral belt widens from 40 miles to about 85 miles. You can think of these shear zones as the plumbing along which the ore was depositing. The ore deposits tend to be at the intersections of the shears. So generally, there are three types of ore bodies in the Colorado mineral belt. The particular geology depends on the interplay of the overlying rocks with the metallic fluids. In the northeast portion, excuse me, we have veins in Precambrian rocks. They commonly border laramide intrusions. The ore bodies in this area are typically small and high grade. And this portion of the mineral belt kind of runs between Jamestown and Breckenridge. In the central portion of the mineral belt, this is where we have replacement deposits in sedimentary rocks, and the Leadville limestone is the most important ore host. The mineralization in this area is mainly silver, lead, zinc, or lead-zinc deposits. In the southern portion are veins in volcanic rocks. These ores are a mixture of gold, silver, lead, zinc, and copper, and they filled in the fractures in the rock. These include the deposits in the San Juan Mountains and in Cripple Creek. Cripple Creek, incidentally, is a collapsed volcano. That's its specific geology. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the timeline for gold discoveries in Colorado. But basically, rumblings of gold were around for some time since the early 1800s. In 1820, traces of color were found near the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. When everyone got excited about the gold discovery at Sutter's Mill in California in 1849, there was a rush to get there, and it was so great that Colorado was essentially passed up. The Colorado gold rush didn't really occur until 10 years after the California gold rush. The Colorado rush was then known as the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and it started with William Green Russell discovering some minor deposits of gold in the Englewood area. These weren't very large, though, and quickly were played out. The really major discovery that opened up the state was by John Gregory, and that was in 1859, and that was a lode gold discovery up in Gregory Gulch, up Clear Creek, by the current town of Black Hawk. Soon after Gregory's discovery, thousands of people were searching for gold in and around Gregory Gulch, and Central City grew very, very rapidly. In the 1970s, pneumatic drills and dynamite were adopted, and more sophisticated mills were developed. In 1890, there was the major strike at Cripple Creek, and this was the largest gold strike in Colorado. In 1942, during World War II, gold mining was declared non-essential, and many mines were shut down and were never reopened. And in 1971, finally the U.S. went off the gold standard and price controls were removed. Most all gold is used in jewelry, and used for making coinage is another use, and then there are some industrial uses for it. This is what happened with silver in Colorado. In 1877, silver was discovered in Leadville, and a huge silver boom followed. Between 1878 and 1890, there was various federal legislation derived at artificially propping up the price of silver. So the U.S. Treasury was directed to buy silver at certain prices. But that was really unworkable economically. And in 1893, Congress demonetized silver, and the U.S. stopped buying it, and silver production absolutely crashed. Many of the silver mining towns were abandoned at this time. Silver kind of had a little bit of spurt again in the Depression era years when the U.S. started buying some again for coinage. But by 1970, silver was eliminated from U.S. coins, and since then it has just been a precious metal. It has no other value. This is the historic gold production in Colorado. So this really shows you that the peak of production, or the most gold that Colorado mined, was in 1899 and 1900. So at that time, the price of gold was fixed, as it was for almost 150 years. You can see in later years that even though the price of gold per ounce shot way up, that the volume didn't really increase, which is the yellow line on the slide. So that's telling you that basically the deposits were mostly mined out by that time, and no more gold could be extracted. So we'll talk a little bit about the history and what happened during that time. So this is historic gold production by county, and this shows you that Teller, which is where Cripple Creek is far and away the largest gold producer in Colorado, and it's followed by Gilpin, Lake, San Miguel, and Ouray. So those are the areas where we predominantly find the gold mines. I want to talk a little bit about the history of Leadville. Leadville was the epicenter of silver mining in Colorado. Gold was originally discovered there in late 1859 during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, but initially discovery was small. Then a richer discovery of placer gold was made in Oro City. That didn't last too long, and by 1874, most of that placer mining was played out, and many claims were consolidated. The population had collapsed. But at that time, the miners had an assay done on this heavy black sand that was kind of impeding their progress mining gold. It turned out to be a lead mineral, and it had a high content of silver. So the prospectors traced this back to its source and found the big silver lead deposits that were the foundation of Leadville's economy. The silver minerals were in veins in bedrock, and so they had to be hard rock mined. What we want to talk about at this point is how gold is actually found. So gold is found in many places in very small concentrations. You can find it in seawater, it's in many types of rocks, but it can only be mined where it's highly concentrated through geologic processes. So primary deposits, which is what most people think of, are the native metals. And this is what you call pure gold, but that's where you find nuggets, veins, or flakes of gold and silver. It can also be found alloyed with silver and other metals. True pure gold compounds are not common, so it's much more common to find it combined with other metals. There's also secondary gold deposits, and those are where the gold's been concentrated by geologic processes and mainly by river action. And so gold is washed from the outcrops into the streams, and it's very heavy in specific gravity, so it settles into the bottom. And these are what you call the placer deposits. And finally, there are refractory ores. And those are ores in which very ultrafine gold particles are disseminated throughout gold-occluded minerals. These are actually extremely important for Colorado and form much of what Colorado's mining industry was based on after the first initial ores were played out. So claims, just a word about claims. You can still stake claims. A prospector had to do a certain amount of dollar work on a claim to keep it. And today you have to actually profitably mine the claim to patent it. In the past, you didn't have to work it for profit. You just had to work a certain dollar amount. So claims can still be sold, older claims, but it's very difficult to get new ones patented today. So once you had your claim, you had to figure out what you actually had. So generally, most gold is finely disseminated in the host rock, so you can't really tell what you have unless you have it assayed. And this is a shot, it's a wonderful William Henry Jackson photograph from 1897 of an assayer. So after a prospector staked a claim and got what they thought was some ore with gold in it, they would take it to an assayer and he would melt it off and gauge how much gold was in it. So this is, now we'll talk a little bit about gold mining methods. So placer gold can be recovered in several ways. When you obtain gold in a pan, as you're panning for gold, you get a lot of black sand in with it. This is called magnetite. And it often stays in the pan because it's also high in specific gravity. So you can separate the gold from the magnetite with a magnet. Gold is also soluble in mercury, so mercury can be mixed with the panned product. The problem now is to remove the mercury. One old way of doing it was to pour the amalgam into a potato and bake it. And the mercury would evaporate into the potato, leaving the gold. This didn't allow you to recover the mercury and also released some toxic vapors. So also people used a retort, which would allow you to recycle the mercury. But obviously a placer miner had to find large nuggets or a lot of dust to make it worthwhile. It was often worthwhile for the first miners, but there's only so much gold in the stream to start with, and so it would play out with continued placering. This slide shows 3 miners in Bournes Gulch, La Plata County, sluicing for gold. Another method of gold mining was by placer deposits was by hydraulics. Essentially, this is high-pressured washing of the sediments to separate out the gold. This photograph shows a dredge in La Plata County. Dredges were also used to separate out placer deposits, and they were used all around Breckenridge and Fairplay back in the day. But the placer deposits were only part of the story. Most of the gold in Colorado has been recovered from hard rock mines. This slide shows a supply train loaded with boxes on 6th Street in Georgetown. They were headed up to the Argentine mine. Hard rock mining has many more problems than placer mining. The ore has to be dug from under the ground, brought to the surface, then milled to remove the precious metal from the host rock. The easiest way to remove the underground ore is to tunnel beneath the vein and then use gravity to drop the ore into carts and then haul it out. A horizontal tunnel might be driven into the side of a mountain beneath a vein, or a vertical shaft might be dug down until it reaches below the vein, and then horizontal drifts or crosscuts are tunneled out from the vertical. This is an old map of a portion of one of the mines in the Cripple Creek district, and you can see how complex it is underground. As the vein is followed further down, the vertical shaft is extended deeper and more drifts are dug out from it. So you can have many levels in these mines, and they can go to some pretty significant depths. So tracks would be laid in the horizontal tunnels to move the ore carts around, and these were often pulled by mules initially. The vertical shafts also required hoists, and these might vary from a hand-cranked windlass to a large hoist house with a steam or electric power engine driving big spools of cable. And often if you go to an old mine, that's the type of structure that you may see around the mouth of the tunnel, is some of the hoist works. So extending the shafts of the mines could be done with pick and shovel, but usually explosives were used. So holes had to be drilled in which to place the explosive charges. Prior to 1875, when machine drills and dynamite came into widespread use, the principal tools were hand drills, which are called steels, and black powder. Hand drills had a sharp drill bit on the end of a steel rod that was driven into the rock with a sledgehammer. In single jacking, one miner did the whole job, but double jacking was much faster. The steels were turned constantly to keep them from sticking, and a good team of double jack men could deliver as many as 60 blows a minute. Ordinarily, it took about an hour to drill the holes to the average depth of 30 inches. The large mines were usually kept operational on a 24-hour basis. 2 shifts worked 10 hours each, with 2 hours between each shift to let the dust settle and provide for the workforce to come in and out. Commonly, one shift would drill, set, and explode the charges, leaving the area for the next shift to come in, clean up after the charge had been detonated, and repeat the process. And you could advance the mine about 3 feet per each shift. In the 1870s, the hand drills and black powder were replaced with pneumatic drills and dynamite. In the pneumatic drills, run by compressed air supplied from the surface, were much faster and required fewer men to operate. So they did provide fresh air to the miners, but the pneumatic drills stirred up quite a bit of dust, and so then that led to a lung disease called miner's consumption. This was a common problem for about 20 years till the mid-1890s, when water flush drills came into use. And dynamite, which is about 4 times more powerful than black powder, had the disadvantage that it released clouds of toxic fumes. In poorly ventilated mines, miners who entered too soon after a charge could pass out. In the long run, the use of pneumatic drills and dynamite, however, actually increased the workforce because you could mine much lower grade ore. The greatest advances, though, in the mining process came in the milling and smelting. Basically, the ore obtained from hard rock mining needs to be crushed and the precious metals physically and chemically separated from the host rock and then recovered. An early, simple manner of crushing ore was the use of an arastra. An arastra was merely a circular stone, usually placed near a stream, on top of which was placed another stone that was turned to crush the ore lying between the two. A burro or a horse or such animal would walk circles around the arastra, dragging the crushing stone behind them. The stream would wash away the debris, leaving behind the heavier material. This process worked fine for free milling gold, but much ore, especially that containing silver, did not have the right composition to work with an arastra. This photo is a view of the headframe of a mine near Sunshine in Boulder County. The next step up from arastra was a stamp mill. Stamp mills crushed the ore by mechanically elevating and dropping heavy iron pistons onto ore that was held in a trough below. Animals linked to a gearing mechanism provided the driving force, and steam engines came into use. The sophisticated mills were large structures which from top to bottom broke up the ore using large steel jaws, crushed it by pounding heavy stamps lifted by cams. Then the ore was tumbled with steel balls and then processed. Initially, the plates were covered with mercury, and after the ore was crushed in stamp mills, the ground material would be run across the plates. The gold combined with the mercury and formed an amalgam. After amalgamation, the remaining ground rock would be washed across concentration tables to catch any remaining gold. But the deposits of free gold were playing out between 1864 and 1868. The problem was that a lot of the remaining Colorado ores were refractory ores, which meant they had the ultrafine gold particles, and they were resistant to the established methods of trying to recover gold. So miners tried all sorts of things to improve recovery. This was the period they called process mania, in which all kinds of novel methods were tried. Basically, a breakthrough was made by Nathaniel P. Hill in 1867 when he opened his smelting operations in Black Hawk. He was a Brown University professor who came west to study gold recovery. He went to Wales and studied European mining methods and then brought those back to Black Hawk. So Hill's process had sulfide ore and it was roasted. Then the gold usually occurred in this ore as inclusions in pyrite. So roasting drove off about 96% of the ore's sulfur content, which also resulted in clouds of sulfur dioxide gas. But the roasted ore was then placed on a hearth in a reverberatory furnace where it was heated to 1400 degrees centigrade for 6 to 8 hours. Almost everything melted in the furnace, the gold, silver, copper, and some lead, and iron would combine with molten silica to form a slag that floated on top of the molten metals. The metals were poured out to harden and cool, and they made something called copper matte. And this was a metallic mix of copper sulfide that contained gold and silver. Initially, this matte was shipped to Wales, where it was refined and separated into gold, silver, and copper. The Black Hawk smelter was a huge success. Workers were hired, employees wanted to live close to their jobs, and the population of Black Hawk climbed to 2,000 people. Eventually, there were some 60 ore treating plants along North Clear Creek, and the creek also was extensively worked for placers, had some 30 arrastras working along it. Initially, Hill shipped the copper matte to Wales for final processing, but he wanted to do the whole process in Colorado. So he hired Richard Pierce, who was a Cornishman, to work out the final refining steps and supervise the plant. Well, Pierce's process proved to be the best separation technique for the metals, and it became the industry standard for many years. In 1873, Hill began to do every step of ore processing in Colorado, and he relocated his business to the Globeville neighborhood in North Denver in 1877, and he established the Argo Smelter Works. The plant processed gold, silver, and copper ores for more than 30 years and finally closed in 1910. It was one of several very large smelters that set up shop in Globeville, which was actually named for the Globe smelter, which is pictured. This is a photograph of a man hoisting a pot full of melted slag and preparing to tap it into a granulating pit at the Argo Smelter Works in Denver. Near the end of the 19th century, the cyanide process was invented, whereby ore could be dissolved in a solution of sodium cyanide, and then the solution passed through boxes of fine zinc shavings to which gold and silver would adhere. The precious metals could then be separated from the zinc by heating, and the result was a virtually 100% recovery. This led to the reworking of many old mine dumps and mine tailings, and resulted in another little gold rush. In the 1920s, flotation technology was developed, but eventually, Colorado's mines were mostly exhausted and most gold mining ceased. Still, there is some that goes on. Far and away, the largest present operation is in Teller County. In 2015, Newmont Mining Corp. Acquired the Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mining Company, and that consists of the Crescent Surface Mine. This is a low-grade ore that has an average resource grade of 0.022 ounces of gold per ton. Historically, good quality ores in the Cripple Creek district were between 3 and 5 ounces per ton. So Newmont uses both heap leaching, a process developed in the 1970s that allows for recovery of very low-grade gold concentrations, and they also have a traditional mill. This is a shot of the open pit of the CC&V gold mine. Other gold is recovered from various small mines and placer deposits. In 2017, there were 34 active gold mining permits in Colorado. And that's the end of my talk. I hope I gave you a little sense of the history of gold mining in Colorado and where it still stands today. Thank you.